narcissism involves much more than just a buzzword people often throw around. It represents a complicated person and personality characteristic where an individual holds an exaggerated opinion of their personal importance, a profound requirement for praise, and a shortage of real compassion for others. When this narcissism manifests in a spouse, it can turn a marital bond into a constant struggle where affection and honor are slowly dissolved. Gaining insight into this narcissistic conduct within a marriage isn't merely useful, it's absolutely vital. Why? Because the psychological and emotional harm to the wife can be ruinous. A narcissistic spouse doesn't solely wound his wife through his obvious actions or statements. He assails her confidence, dominates her via manipulation, and frequently causes her to feel disconnected and bewildered. This particular kind of harmful pattern can silently devastate a woman's belief in her own worth and her mental tranquility. However, here is the essential truth. Understanding stands as the initial move toward liberation. By being able to identify the strategies and behaviors of a narcissistic spouse, a wife can recover control and safeguard herself from more damage. This awareness empowers her to establish personal limitations, seek assistance, and start the journey of recovery. In this discussion, we will explore precisely how a narcissistic husband engages with his wife, the subtle and obvious methods his actions undermine her self-belief, separate her from others, and keep her caught in a continuous painful loop. By the time we conclude, you will be able to spot these detrimental behaviors and discover sensible methods to preserve your emotional health and reclaim your existence. Let's delve into the details. The first point is the facade of charisma and certainty. When we discuss spouses with narcissistic traits, it is essential to comprehend that their initial approach frequently starts with what seems like an irresistible attraction. They present themselves wearing a disguise of charm and self-assurance. This facade is so persuasive, so captivating, that it draws others into their sphere of influence with hardly any effort. This charm is not just superficial pleasantness or common friendliness. It is a deliberately constructed image meant to enchant and dominate. At the heart of this mask lies a deep-seated insecurity and vulnerability. The narcissist's exaggerated self-importance, the confidence, the audacity, these are compensations for an inner emptiness, a shattered sense of self that necessitates continuous external validation. Mm-hmm. Yet on the surface, they project certainty, authority, and an almost intoxicating power that is deeply attractive, especially to people looking for reliability and admiration. For a wife, this initial stage can feel like entering a perfect love story. The narcissistic spouse lavishes her with compliments, grand romantic gestures, and an impression of being uniquely valued, something she might not have previously experienced. She feels recognized, wanted, and elevated. This is no mere chance. The narcissist is acutely aware that his charisma is the key to gaining influence and control. He invests energy into generating an idealized perception of himself that others will respect and desire. But this attractiveness is a dangerous, double-edged tool. While it creates a powerful feeling of safety and affection early on, it is a false security and illusion. The wife becomes connected not to the genuine individual, but to this fabricated fantasy. This fantasy hides the fundamental patterns of domination, manipulation, and emotional distance that will soon surface. The confidence she admires is a pretense concealing insecurity. The praise serves as instruments to lower her barriers, and the large gestures are investments in an emotional debt she will unknowingly repay later. For instance, consider a wife who remembers how her husband's initial heartfelt statements made her feel like the most treasured person alive. She felt uplifted, adored, and safe. But as time proceeds, the mask slips and the underlying actions begin to surface. The control, the demands, the removal of affection. What once felt like security transforms into confusion and distress. Understanding this facade is crucial. It teaches us to look beyond surface appeal and doubt the underlying character. It is the first step towards safeguarding oneself from the subtle entrapments of narcissistic relationships. The second point is the slow deterioration of self-respect. Belief. One of the most harmful aspects of a narcissistic husband's behavior is not sudden cruelty and massive dramatic outbursts, but instead the steady, gradual wearing away of his wife's sense of self-worth. This is not a sharp impact. It is a never-ending flow of minor critiques, subtle put-downs, and hidden actions of belittling that build up over time. It resembles a slow, acting toxin that undermines confidence and plants seeds of uncertainty that blossom into self-criticism. At first, these disparagements might seem insignificant or even unintentional. A thoughtless comment about her being too easily hurt or a dismissive opinion about her personal decisions. But when these remarks become routine, they begin to shape the wife's internal thoughts. She starts to doubt her judgment, her memory, even her actual perception of events. This is the defining characteristic of what psychologists call gaslighting, a deliberate tactic of manipulation where the narcissist denies or twists facts to make the wife question her own lived experience. Gaslighting is deeply destabilizing. Imagine existing in a situation where your memories, your emotions, your reality are constantly invalidated by the person who is meant to love and support you. Over an extended period, this causes you to feel unstable or overly sensitive, not because there's an issue with you, but because the narcissist's methods are designed to destroy your sense of self. It is a vicious power play. If he can control what you believe about yourself, he controls you. This manipulation is not always direct. Sometimes it's conveyed through silence or emotional retreat, slight variations in tone, or the strategic use of assigning blame. The narcissistic husband might say, "You are misremembering it," or "You are making too big a deal of it again," dismissing her anxieties and making her doubt her own mind. The wife begins to absorb these messages, which harms her self-respect and makes her more reliant on his approval. Consider the story of a wife who over several months and years began to feel as though she was losing her grasp on reality. She clearly recalls discussions and occurrences, but her husband denies them or alters them, calling her suspicious or delusional. The outcome is that she begins apologizing for her supposed errors, silencing her own opinions, and diminishing herself. Understanding this slow decline is vital because it highlights the psychological struggle that is happening. It is not only about what is spoken, but what is left unsaid, the space between words filled with uncertainty and bewilderment. Recognizing this technique is the initial step toward recovering one's sense of mind and rebuilding self-respect. The third point is dominating through emotional maneuvering. One of the most potent instruments a narcissistic husband wields is emotional manipulation. Unlike simple hostility, which is easy to notice and resist, emotional manipulation operates in the shadows. It is subtle, insidious, and highly effective at controlling his wife's conduct. He utilizes methods like guilt, fault finding, and the refusal to speak, not because he lacks affection, but precisely because he wishes to govern her feelings and keep her off balance. guilt is among the most destructive forces in a partnership. The narcissistic husband employs it to make his wife feel accountable for his unhappiness or failures. If you genuinely cared about me, you would, or I wouldn't feel this way if you just are statements heavy with blame intended to shift responsibility onto her. It's a psychological trap. By making her the custodian of his fragile self-image, he guarantees she remains attentive and compliant, constantly striving to rectify something that is never truly broken because the issue is him. Then comes the silent treatment, a particularly cruel weapon. When the wife dares to stand up for herself or question his actions, he emotionally withdraws. Not just affection, but communication itself. This retreat is a form of discipline, establishing an emotional void where anxiety and confusion flourish. The wife, desperate to re-establish connection, often blames herself and rushes to correct the situation even when she has done nothing wrong. This cycle of penalty and reward trains her to extremely cautious, always watchful to avoid causing his displeasure. This dynamic is not coincidental. It is a learned pattern of exercising control. The narcissist thrives on power, and emotional maneuvering is his technique for upholding dominance. The wife's emotional requirements become a negotiating factor, and her yearning for love and acceptance is taken advantage of to guarantee obedience. Consider the wife who attempts to establish a boundary or voice an emotion only to be met with cold silence or withdrawal. She feels rejected and isolated. Her emotional state is destabilized to bring back peace. She surrenders, modifying her actions to prevent future punishments. Over time, this routine erodes her feeling of independence and self-belief. Recognizing this manipulation is crucial. Awareness breaks the enchantment. Understanding the patterns enables the wife to reclaim her emotional decision-making power, reject the control, and demand the respect she merits. The fourth point is the requirement for continuous praise. At the core of narcissistic conduct lies a vulnerable ego, a sensitive, delicate self that requires ongoing strengthening. Narcissistic husbands need constant praise and focus much like a plant needs water. Without it, their self-perception starts to diminish, exposing the deep insecurity hidden beneath their confident exterior. This non-stop necessity for validation is not just a personal trait. It is a major force behind most of their actions. They are always looking for affirmation, compliments, and recognition to sustain a self that cannot stand alone. The narcissist's ego resembles a fragile structure. Any challenge or neglect threatens to collapse it. For the wife, this means she is forced into the role of an emotional caregiver, often without realizing it. She becomes the provider of his self-esteem, constantly expected to support his fragile self-image. Praise, admiration, and emotional support are not occasional gifts. They become daily demands. If she fails to satisfy these demands, the repercussions are immediate and disciplinary. Consider the husband who throws a fit or withdraws affection simply because he didn't receive enough praise or because she dares to discuss her own achievements. His reaction is excessive, not because of what was said, but because it endangers his fragile self-worth. The wife quickly learns that her accomplishments must be downplayed or kept quiet so as not to trigger his insecurity. This dynamic creates a damaging inequality. Instead of being a partnership of equals, the marriage becomes a stage where the narcissist requires an endless stream of applause, while the wife's needs and triumphs are overshadowed or disregarded. Her emotional effort grows tremendously as she continuously navigates the unstable terrain of his ego. Recognizing this need for constant praise is essential. It reveals the narcissist's profound dependence on external approval and the unjust burden placed upon the wife. Awareness enables her to see this pattern clearly, realize that the issue is not with her, but with his fragile ego, and to begin establishing healthier limitations for her own well-being. The fifth point is the absence of genuine understanding. Empathy, the capacity to truly comprehend and share the emotions of another, is a fundamental pillar of healthy relationships. It is what allows two people to connect deeply, to support each other through life's inevitable challenges. But in the situation of a narcissistic husband, real empathy is deeply lacking. It's not merely a failure or a deficiency. It is frequently a refusal, a fundamental void in the narcissist's emotional makeup. The narcissists are fundamentally focused on themselves. Their attention is consumed by their own needs, anxieties, and desires. To truly empathize with another requires vulnerability and self-transcendence, attributes that narcissists tend to avoid because they threaten the unstable illusion of control they maintain over their self-perception. This emotional aloofness is devastating for a wife when she shares her weaknesses, her fears, her pain, or her aspirations. She is met not with compassion, but indifference or dismissal. Instead of giving space for her emotions, the narcissist frequently changes the subject, directs the conversation back to himself, or simply disregards her emotional reality. This creates a deep sense of isolation, even within the intimacy of the marriage. Picture a wife opening up her heart, sharing a moment of serious hardship, only to be met with a blank expression or a casual comment that minimizes her experience. This lack of acknowledgement signifies not just insensitivity, but an emotional emptiness. Over time, these repeated instances teach the wife that her feelings are unseen, her needs unimportant, and her pain insignificant. This absence of empathy breeds isolation and hopelessness. It destroys trust and emotional security, leaving the wife feeling abandoned in the very relationship that ought to be her safe haven. It is a type of emotional neglect that wounds deeply and quietly. Understanding this lack of empathy helps explain why the narcissistic relationship is so damaging. It is not only about what is done, but about what is withheld, the basic human connection and understanding that the narcissist refuses to offer. Recognizing this absence is the initial action toward reclaiming one's emotional well-being and seeking relationships where empathy is present and mutual. The sixth point is the public versus private image. One of the most confusing and harmful elements of dealing with a narcissistic husband is the stark difference between his public and private identities. In public, he often presents himself as the perfect spouse, charming, respectful, thoughtful, everything a wife could wish for in the eyes of acquaintances, family, and the community. But behind locked doors, this carefully built exterior falls apart, revealing a toxic, controlling, and frequently cruel reality. This dual nature is not accidental. Narcissists are fully conscious of how others perceive them. Their public image is a meticulously managed performance intended to guarantee admiration and preserve status. They comprehend that public approval bolsters their fragile ego and protects their standing. Therefore, they invest great energy in appearing flawless, even exemplary. For the wife, this creates deep uncertainty. On one hand, she endures emotional neglect, manipulation, or outright unkindness at home. On the other, Her husband's public persona makes her feel isolated and doubted when she attempts to share her struggles. Acquaintances and relatives see a loving, attentive partner and may question her statements or blame her for misinterpreting his actions. This isolation is a deliberate outcome of the narcissist's dishonesty. Consider a wife who observes her husband interacting warmly and respectfully